The Albertson family reunion arrived every July with the predictability of summer storms, beautiful on the surface, turbulent underneath. I'd learned to brace myself for the inevitable moment when Uncle Gary, surrounded by cousins discussing vacation homes and investment returns, would make some announcement about family assets that reminded everyone I had no real claim to anything. Not even the house where Grandma Patricia raised me after my parents died. The reunion unfolded at Uncle Gary's lakeside estate like a carefully orchestrated performance. Luxury SUVs and German sedans lined the circular driveway, their paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. The conversation hummed with talk of property portfolios, market trends, and career milestones, what I'd come to think of as legacy theater, where every cousin had a new achievement to showcase and every parent had something to compare. I pulled up in my 7-year-old Honda Civic, its faded blue paint a stark contrast to the showroom-worthy vehicles surrounding it. My sundress came from a thrift store downtown. I lived in a studio apartment across town, worked at what they dismissively called that community center, and by every visible measure, I had become exactly what they expected after losing my parents at 7, someone to be pitied, managed, and ultimately overlooked. As I walked toward the gathering, I could feel the familiar weight settling over me. The sympathetic glances. The carefully worded questions that assumed struggle rather than choice. Uncle Gary held court at the center, gesturing broadly as he discussed his latest development project, the self-appointed patriarch who'd taken charge of family interests after Grandma Patricia died. I approached with what I'd perfected over the years, a quiet resignation mixed with something that hurt more than I wanted to admit. This was the annual reminder of what Suzanne didn't become. But this year felt different. Uncle Gary had mentioned important family business, and I knew whatever he planned to announce would reinforce my place at the margins of this family. You don't want to miss what happened next. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single detail of how this went down. Uncle Gary's estate sprawled across 3 acres of prime lakefront property, the kind of place that appeared in regional architecture magazines with captions about modern luxury meets natural beauty. The main house rose in tiers of glass and cedar, its massive windows reflecting the afternoon sun off the lake. A stone pathway wound through manicured gardens toward the expansive deck where the family gathered, drinks in hand, laughter echoing across the water. I parked my Honda at the far end of the driveway, tucked behind Cousin Jennifer's gleaming white Tesla and Uncle Marcus's new Range Rover. As I stepped out, I caught my reflection in Jennifer's driver's side window. My cotton sundress looked even more worn next to the polished chrome and leather interior visible through the glass. She'd probably paid more for her car's sound system than I paid in rent for 6 months. The deck buzzed with the familiar rhythm of Albertson gatherings. Aunt Carol stood near the outdoor kitchen, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gestured animatedly about her recent renovation, something about Italian marble and a wine cellar that cost more than most people's homes. Cousin David held court with Uncle Marcus and 2 other relatives, discussing cap rates and property appreciation in emerging markets. His Rolex caught my eye as he checked it, nodding along to whatever investment wisdom Uncle Marcus was dispensing. Suzanne. Aunt Linda approached with that careful smile I'd come to recognize, the one that said she felt sorry for me but wasn't quite sure what to say. You made it. How's everything? Everything. The word hung there, a placeholder for all the things she didn't ask about because she'd already decided she knew the answers. Everything's good, I said, returning her smile. Work's been busy. Oh, that's wonderful, she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Still at the community center? Still there. She patted my arm. Well, that's important work, honey. Not everyone needs to chase money, right? She glanced over her shoulder. Gary's about to make an announcement. Something about family business. You should grab a seat. I watched her return to her cluster of relatives, already whispering to Aunt Carol, and I felt that old familiar ache settle in my chest. It always came back to this, the reunion, The comparisons, the unspoken hierarchy of who had succeeded and who had simply survived. I was 7 when the police knocked on Grandma Patricia's door. 7 when I learned that a drunk driver on Route 9 had taken both my parents in an instant. 7 when I moved into the old Victorian house on Maple Street, where Grandma tucked me into bed every night and promised me that I was loved, that I was safe, that I belonged somewhere. That house was the only home I'd ever really known. The kitchen where Grandma taught me to bake bread. The porch where we'd sit on summer evenings, her hand in mine, talking about everything and nothing. The small bedroom under the eaves where I'd study late into the night, working towards something she believed I could achieve even when I doubted myself. Now, 18 years later, I stood on Uncle Gary's luxury deck, watching my family discuss investment portfolios and vacation homes, and I wondered what Grandma would think of all this. What she would think of them. What she would think of me. Uncle Gary's voice cut through the conversations like a gavel. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for a moment." He stood near the stone fire pit, one hand raised, the other holding a tumbler of scotch. The late afternoon sun cast him in perfect light, as if he'd staged it that way. "Family, gather round. I need to discuss something important." The chatter died down. Chairs scraped against the deck as people shifted toward him. Aunt Carol settled into one of the cushioned loungers. Cousin Jennifer perched on the armrest beside her mother, phone still in hand. Uncle Marcus stood with his arms crossed, nodding as if he already knew what was coming. Maybe he did. I stayed where I was, at the edge of the gathering, my back against the deck railing. From here, I could see everyone's faces, read their expressions, gauge their reactions. It was the observer's position, the one I'd occupied at every family event for as long as I could remember. As you all know, Uncle Gary began, his tone shifting into what I called his boardroom voice, measured, authoritative, final. "We've been managing the family estate since Mother passed 8 years ago. It's been a responsibility I've taken seriously, consulting with Marcus and Carol on major decisions." He paused, taking a sip of his drink. "The real estate market right now is exceptionally strong. Properties in the historic district are commanding premium prices, and after careful consideration, we've decided it's time to make a strategic move." My stomach tightened. I knew what was coming before he said it. "We're selling Mother's house." The words landed like stones in still water. Ripples of reaction spread through the gathered family, some nodding in agreement, others exchanging glances, a few murmuring approval. Uncle Gary continued as if he were presenting a business proposal, not dismantling the only home I'd ever loved. "The market's strong and, frankly, it's time to liquidate the asset. The property's been sitting vacant, accumulating maintenance costs and property taxes. It doesn't make financial sense to hold on to it for sentimental reasons when we could be maximizing its value." He gestured with his glass, encompassing the group. "This is about smart wealth management for the entire family. The proceeds will be divided according to Mother's will, and everyone will benefit from the sale." Aunt Carol nodded vigorously. "It's the practical choice, Gary. The house needs work, new roof, updated electrical. It would cost a fortune to renovate." "Exactly," Uncle Gary said, pointing at her as if she'd just made the winning argument in a courtroom. "We're looking at 6 figures just to bring it up to modern standards. Better to sell as is to a developer or investor who sees the potential." I felt the familiar sting spreading through my chest, that hot, tight sensation that came with being erased. Not once had Uncle Gary said, "We should discuss this," or "Let's talk as a family." He'd already made the decision. He'd consulted Marcus and Carol, the successful ones, the ones with money and influence and opinions that mattered. He spoke as if he had the authority. As if the house on Maple Street was just another line item on a balance sheet, another property in his portfolio to be evaluated and liquidated. As if Grandma Patricia's home, my home, was nothing more than an underperforming asset. "I've already been in contact with Rebecca Morrison at Premier Properties," Uncle Gary continued. "She's confident we can list within the month and have offers within 2 weeks. The location alone will draw serious buyers." I stared at him, at his confident posture and self-satisfied expression, and something inside me went very still. This wasn't a family discussion. This was a pronouncement. This was Uncle Gary doing what he'd always done, making decisions about things that weren't his to decide, speaking for people who'd never given him permission to speak, managing lives that had never asked to be managed. And once again, I hadn't even been considered worth consulting. Then Uncle Gary's gaze found me across the deck, and his expression softened into something that might have passed for compassion if you didn't know him better. "Suzanne, honey," he said, his voice taking on that patronizing gentleness people use when delivering bad news to children. "I know this must be difficult for you. You have memories in that house, we all do. Mother raised you there after your parents passed, and that's significant." The family turned to look at me. I could feel their eyes, their pity, their assumption that I was about to cry or protest or make some emotional scene that would need to be gently managed. "But we want to be fair," Uncle Gary continued, gesturing magnanimously. "We'll make sure you get a small share of the proceeds. It's what Mother would have wanted, taking care of you even now. Consider it a nest egg, something to help you get more stable." A nest egg. As if I were a charity case in need of handouts from my more successful relatives. Cousin Jennifer leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping against her phone case. "I mean, it's probably for the best, Suzanne. You couldn't afford the upkeep anyway, right? Working at that community center." She said it like a question, but her tone made it clear she'd already calculated my entire financial situation and found it wanting. Property taxes alone on that place must be, what, $12,000 a year? Plus maintenance, utilities, insurance. It's not realistic for someone in your situation. Jennifer's right, Aunt Carol chimed in, her voice syrupy with false concern. "That house is a money pit, honey. You'd be drowning in expenses within 6 months. Better to let it go now while the market's good and take your share. You could put it towards something more manageable, maybe a down payment on a condo in a less expensive area." Uncle Marcus nodded sagely. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for family is make the hard decisions they can't make for themselves. Your grandmother wouldn't want you burdened with a property you can't maintain." The condescension was suffocating. They spoke about me as if I weren't standing right there, as if my entire life and capabilities had been thoroughly assessed and dismissed in the time it took them to sip their drinks. "It's about new beginnings," Aunt Linda added softly, reaching out as if to touch my arm but stopping short. "Letting go of the past, honey. You can't live in memories forever. Your grandmother's been gone 8 years now. Maybe it's time to move forward, start fresh. This could be good for you." "Exactly," Uncle Gary said, warming to the theme as if he were delivering a motivational speech. "This is an opportunity, Suzanne. Take your share, invest it wisely. I can recommend some people if you'd like, and build something new. You're still young enough to turn things around." Turn things around. As if my life were a failed business venture in need of restructuring. He straightened, his moment of manufactured sympathy apparently concluded. "Now, as I was saying, we've already contacted Rebecca Morrison at Premier Properties. She's one of the best in the historic district, sold the Hendersons' place for well above asking last month." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what I assumed were emails or listings. "The house should go on the market next month. Rebecca thinks we should list it at $575,000, though she's confident we'll get multiple offers and could see it go for $600 or more. The historic designation actually works in our favor with the right buyer." He looked up, scanning the family with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just successfully navigated a potential conflict. "So that's settled then. I'll have my attorney draw up the paperwork for the distribution of proceeds. Any questions?" Nobody spoke. The matter was closed. Uncle Gary had decided, the family had agreed, and I had been neatly categorized, sympathized with, and dismissed. All that remained was for me to accept my small share and be grateful for their generosity. I smiled. It wasn't the resigned smile I'd worn walking up to the deck, or the polite smile I'd given Aunt Linda earlier. This was something else entirely, calm, almost serene, the kind of smile that comes when you've spent 8 years preparing for a moment you knew would eventually arrive. "That's interesting, Uncle Gary," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the deck in the sudden quiet. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding." Uncle Gary's expression flickered confusion, then irritation, then back to that patronizing patience. He set down his phone with exaggerated care. "Suzanne, honey, I know you're emotional about this. It's completely understandable. The house has sentimental value to you, and nobody's dismissing that. But I'm not emotional," I interrupted, keeping my tone even. "I'm telling you there's been a misunderstanding." Cousin Jennifer exchanged a glance with her mother. Aunt Carol's mouth tightened into that thin line that meant she was preparing to explain something obvious to someone who clearly didn't understand how the world worked. Uncle Gary sighed, the sound heavy with strained patience. "Suzanne, I appreciate that you feel attached to the property. We all understand the house represents your childhood, your time with Mother. But these are adult decisions that need to be made based on financial realities, not sentiment. The adults need to make practical choices here, and—" "No," I said, my smile never wavering. "I mean there's been a legal misunderstanding." The word legal hung in the air like a sudden change in atmospheric pressure. Uncle Gary's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing slightly. Around the deck, conversations that had resumed in low murmurs fell silent again. "A legal misunderstanding," he repeated slowly, his tone now carrying an edge. "Suzanne, if you're thinking about contesting the will or making some kind of claim, I should tell you that Mother's estate was settled 8 years ago. Everything was handled properly by professionals. You can't just—" "I'm not contesting anything," I said. "I'm clarifying something." Uncle Marcus stepped forward, his arms still crossed. "Suzanne, if this is about your share of the proceeds, we've already said you'll be included. There's no need to bring lawyers into this or make things complicated." "I'm not making things complicated," I said, maintaining that same calm tone. "I'm trying to tell you that you can't sell the house." Uncle Gary's face reddened. "Now, listen here. I don't know what you think you're going to accomplish with this, but the house is family property, and as the executor of Mother's estate—" "You were the executor," I corrected gently. 8 years ago. The estate was settled, as you said. Which means you no longer have any authority over—" A sound interrupted me, the distinctive crunch of tires on gravel. All heads turned toward the driveway where a sleek silver Mercedes had just pulled in, parking precisely beside my Honda Civic. The contrast was almost comical, luxury and economy, side by side. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her mid-40s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my car. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and even from the deck, I could see the professional competence in the way she moved, purposeful, assured, unbothered by the 20 pairs of eyes suddenly focused on her. I recognized her immediately. Margaret Chen, Executive Director of the Chen Foundation. Right on time. She spotted me through the crowd and her face lit up with a warm smile. She raised her hand in a wave, then started toward the deck, her heels clicking against the stone pathway with the steady rhythm of inevitability. Uncle Gary turned to me, his expression a mixture of confusion and mounting anger. "Who is that?" "Suzanne, if you've brought some lawyer here to try to." "That's not a lawyer," I said, my smile widening just slightly. Margaret reached the steps to the deck, pausing at the bottom to take in the gathered family with barely concealed amusement. When she spoke, her voice was clear, professional, and completely unbothered by the tension she'd walked into. "I'm so sorry to interrupt your family gathering," she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. "But I'm looking for Suzanne Albertson." She looked directly at me, and I saw the knowing gleam in her eyes. "I have those documents you requested." Margaret ascended the deck steps with the confident grace of someone who walked into boardrooms worth hundreds of millions of dollars without a second thought. Her heels clicked precisely against the wood, and she carried herself with the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten their posture. The leather portfolio under her arm bore the embossed logo of the Chen Foundation, a symbol I knew well, though clearly no one else here did. The family stared at her with various expressions of confusion. Aunt Carol's eyes immediately went to Margaret's suit, assessing, pricing, cataloging. Cousin Jennifer had lowered her phone, actually paying attention for the first time all afternoon. Uncle Marcus's arms had dropped to his sides, his defensive posture momentarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected intrusion. I stepped forward, meeting Margaret halfway across the deck. "Margaret," I said warmly. "Thank you for coming. I know this is out of your way." "Not at all," she replied, her smile genuine as she reached me. She lowered her voice slightly, though not enough to prevent the nearby relatives from hearing. "When you texted that you needed the deed copies today, I figured something important was happening. Board meeting prep can wait." She glanced past me at the gathered family, and I caught the flicker of understanding in her expression. She'd been in enough family situations, both professional and personal, to read a room instantly. The tension, the uncomfortable silence, the way everyone was staring at us like we'd just spoken in a foreign language. "Suzanne," she continued, her voice returning to its normal professional volume, "I'm sorry to interrupt your family time, but those partnership documents need your signature before Monday's board meeting. The expansion into Arizona and New Mexico can't move forward without your approval, and the state compliance paperwork has a deadline. Partnership documents. Board meeting. State expansion." The words floated over the deck like autumn leaves, settling into the silence with visible impact. Uncle Gary had gone very still. His Scotch glass hung forgotten in his hand, condensation dripping onto his deck. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its earlier confidence, replaced by something sharp and territorial. "Excuse me," he said, taking a step forward. His tone carried the unmistakable authority of someone used to being the most important person in any given room. "Who are you?" Margaret turned to face him fully, and I watched her transform. Not dramatically, she didn't need drama. She simply shifted into what I'd come to think of as her executive mode, the version of herself that commanded million-dollar philanthropic initiatives and negotiated with state governors. "I apologize for the intrusion," she said, extending her hand with practiced professionalism. "Margaret Chen. I'm the executive director of the Chen Foundation." She paused just long enough for the foundation's name to register, or not register, in this case, before continuing. "And you are?" Uncle Gary shook her hand automatically, the social conditioning of decades overriding his irritation. "Gary Albertson. This is my home, and this is a private family gathering." "Of course," Margaret said smoothly, not releasing his hand immediately. "How wonderful that Suzanne has family to spend time with. She works so incredibly hard. I worry sometimes that she doesn't take enough personal time. She works so incredibly hard." The phrase landed like a small bomb, detonating quietly in the middle of Uncle Gary's assumptions. He pulled his hand back, frowning. "I'm sorry, but what exactly is your relationship with my niece? What kind of partnership documents are you talking about?" Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, a subtle expression of surprise that managed to convey volumes. She glanced at me, then back at Uncle Gary. "Has Suzanne not told you about the foundation work?" "I know she's modest, but surely," she broke off, as if realizing she'd stumbled into delicate territory. "Margaret works with me," I said quietly, watching Uncle Gary's face. "We've been partners for almost 6 years now." "Partners in what?" Cousin Jennifer called out from her perch on the lounger armrest. Her phone was now forgotten in her lap, her full attention focused on this stranger who'd somehow disrupted the family's carefully constructed narrative. Margaret looked at Jennifer, then at me again, clearly uncertain how much she should say. It was perfectly performed, the hesitation of someone who'd inadvertently exposed information that perhaps wasn't meant to be shared. "In our nonprofit work," I supplied, keeping my voice level. "Margaret's foundation has been collaborating with mine on community development initiatives." "Your foundation?" Uncle Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Suzanne, what are you talking about?" Margaret's expression shifted again, this time to something closer to concern. She turned to me, lowering her voice, but not quite enough to be private. Suzanne, I assumed they knew. I wouldn't have mentioned the board meeting if she looked genuinely distressed now. I'm so sorry. This is obviously not the right time. It's fine, I assured her, though we both knew it was anything but. Actually, the timing might be perfect. Uncle Gary's face had progressed from confusion to something darker. Would someone mind explaining what's going on here? Suzanne, you work at a community center. You don't have a foundation. And partnership documents? What partnership? His voice rose with each question, the frustration of losing control over his own narrative evident in every syllable. Margaret straightened, and I saw her make a decision. She looked directly at Uncle Gary, her expression shifting into something more formal, more official. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone delivering facts that couldn't be disputed. Mr. Albertson, I think there may have been some miscommunication about Suzanne's work. Margaret paused, seeming to gather her thoughts, though I knew her well enough to recognize this was calculated. She was giving the family a moment to prepare for what was coming next. I'm Margaret Chen, Executive Director of the Chen Foundation, as I mentioned. But I'm here today in my capacity as a professional partner and friend. She turned slightly, gesturing to me with a respect that was impossible to miss. I'm looking for Suzanne Albertson, CEO and founder of Bright Futures Foundation. CEO. Founder. The words dropped into the silence like stones into glass, the impact rippling outward in waves of visible shock. Aunt Carol's mouth fell open. Cousin Jennifer's phone actually slipped from her hand, clattering against the deck. Uncle Marcus took a step backward, as if the information had physical force. And Uncle Gary simply froze, his expression cycling through disbelief, confusion, and something that might have been the first flicker of understanding. Nobody spoke. The deck had gone absolutely silent except for the distant sound of water lapping against the shore and the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Margaret continued, apparently oblivious to the bomb she'd just detonated. Her tone remained professional, matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing quarterly reports rather than dismantling 8 years of assumptions. Your foundations work in 14 states, Suzanne. The board was incredibly impressed with the expansion data. The Arizona and New Mexico initiatives alone will serve over 12,000 families in the first year. 14 states. 12,000 families. The numbers hung in the air, incomprehensible to a family that had spent the afternoon discussing vacation homes and investment returns. The Chen Foundation board met yesterday, Margaret went on, pulling a folder from her portfolio and flipping it open. They've approved the expanded partnership I mentioned. An additional $4.2 million in funding over the next 3 years, with the possibility of renewal depending on outcomes. She looked up at me, her expression warm. Your youth programs model is exactly what we've been looking for. The data on educational outcomes and family stability is remarkable. $4.2 million. I watched the number register on my uncle's face, saw him trying to reconcile it with the image of his niece who worked at that community center. Which brings me to the other reason I'm here, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. She reached into her portfolio again, this time extracting a legal-sized envelope with official-looking documents visible through the transparent window. You mentioned you needed copies of the property deed. I know how important that house is to you, to your work. The history there, your grandmother's legacy. She handed me the envelope, and I felt the weight of it, both physical and symbolic. These are certified copies from the county recorder's office. The deed transfer your grandmother executed 3 years before her passing. Margaret's eyes moved to Uncle Gary, her expression still professional but with an edge of something sharper now. The property at 847 Maple Street was legally transferred to Suzanne Albertson 8 years ago, 3 years before Patricia Albertson's death. The transfer was recorded, notarized, and completely legal. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the silence of shock. This was the silence of a world tilting on its axis, of certainties crumbling, of carefully constructed narratives collapsing under the weight of documentation and truth. Uncle Gary's face had gone pale, then flushed red. That's not, the estate was settled. I was the executor. If there had been a property transfer, I would have known. The transfer was separate from the estate, Margaret said calmly, her tone suggesting this was basic legal knowledge. It was completed and recorded years before Mrs. Albertson's passing. It wouldn't have been part of the probate process because the property was no longer in her name at the time of death. She glanced at the papers in my hand. Everything's there. The original deed, the transfer documents, the recording stamps. The house on Maple Street has been legally owned by Suzanne for 8 years. I watched my uncle process this, saw the moment when he realized what it meant. Not just that he couldn't sell the house, but that he'd never had the authority to sell it in the first place. That his entire afternoon pronouncement, his careful explanation of market conditions and financial wisdom, his magnanimous offer to give me a small share, all of it had been built on a foundation that didn't exist. Margaret turned back to me, her expression softening. I also brought the updated operational budget you requested. The accountants finished the quarterly review. She paused, seeming to debate whether to continue, then added, "Last year's operating budget was $47 million, as you know. This year we're projecting $52 million with the expansion. The board wanted you to have the final numbers before the national conference next month. $47 million. $52 million. National conference." Each phrase was another crack in the family's understanding of who I was, what I did, what I'd built. Cousin David finally found his voice. "Suzanne, you run a foundation? A rail foundation? With an operating budget of..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, unable to reconcile the numbers with the woman they'd pitied and dismissed for nearly a decade. Margaret accepted the documents I handed back to her. The partnership agreements needed her review first, and turned her attention fully to Uncle Gary. Her expression shifted into something warmer, more collegial, as if they were peers meeting at a professional conference rather than strangers at a disrupted family gathering. "You must be very proud," she said, and the sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. "Suzanne's foundation has transformed over 300 communities across the country. The work she's doing in youth development, affordable housing, educational access, it's genuinely groundbreaking." She glanced at me with obvious admiration. "Last year's operating budget was $47 million. This year, with our expanded partnership and the new federal grants she secured, we're looking at $52 million. The numbers landed like physical blows. I watched Uncle Gary's face as he tried to process what Margaret had just said. $47 million. His entire real estate development company, the business he'd built over 30 years, the achievement he wore like a badge of honor, probably didn't see that kind of revenue in a good year. She's also been invited to deliver the keynote address at the National Community Development Conference next month," Margaret continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what appeared to be her calendar. "Chicago. 3,000 attendees, including governors, mayors, HUD officials, foundation executives from across the country. The speaking fee alone is $50,000, though Suzanne always donates it back to the foundation." She looked up, smiling. "She's remarkably principled about keeping her personal finances separate from the organization's resources." $50,000. For a single speech. Cousin Jennifer had gone very pale. I knew she'd spent the better part of the afternoon talking about her annual bonus, $35,000 that she'd described as a game changer. Margaret seemed to register the family's stunned silence for the first time. She glanced around the deck, her expression shifting to something that might have been concern or might have been carefully performed confusion. "I'm sorry, I assumed you all knew about Suzanne's work. She's been featured in Forbes, the Chronicle of Philanthropy, even testified before Congress last year about community reinvestment strategies." Congress. Forbes. The words kept coming, each one widening the chasm between who they thought I was and who I actually had become. The foundation employs over 200 people now, Margaret went on, apparently unable to stop herself. Full-time staff in 14 states, plus contractors and program partners. Suzanne's built an organization that rivals some of the most established nonprofits in the country, and she did it in less than a decade. She paused, her expression growing more thoughtful. Your grandmother must have been incredibly proud. I know Suzanne credits her for everything: the values, the vision, the determination to make a real difference in people's lives. At the mention of Grandma Patricia, something in Uncle Gary's expression fractured. He set his scotch glass down on the nearest table with unsteady hands, the ice clinking against the crystal. The house, he said, his voice hoarse. The deed transfer. You said? Yes, Margaret confirmed, her tone matter-of-fact. The deed transfer was recorded 3 years before Mrs. Albertson's passing, making it 8 years ago now. The property at 847 Maple Street has been in Suzanne's name for 8 years. She glanced at me, then back at Uncle Gary. I'm surprised this is news to you, Mr. Albertson. Suzanne mentioned that the family had discussed selling the property, which is why I brought the certified copies today. To clarify the legal situation. Uncle Gary's face had gone from red to white in the space of seconds. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. 8 years, he repeated, the words barely audible. It's been hers for 8 years. Since 3 years before your mother's death, yes, Margaret said gently. The transfer was Mrs. Albertson's decision. Suzanne was in graduate school at the time. She'd just founded Bright Futures, actually, working out of that very house. Your mother saw what she was building and wanted to ensure Suzanne had a stable foundation for the work. She smiled slightly, both literally and figuratively. I watched my uncle absorb this information, saw him realize that Grandma Patricia hadn't just given me the house, she'd chosen to give it to me while he managed the rest of her estate. That she'd looked at what I was doing, what I was building, and decided it mattered more than his real estate assessments or Marcus's investment advice or Carol's renovation plans. That she'd seen in me something worth investing in, something worth believing in, something he'd never bothered to look for. I should mention, Margaret added, almost as an afterthought, that Suzanne recently purchased 2 adjacent properties on Maple Street as well. She's planning to expand, turn the entire block into a community resource center. The Patricia Albertson Center for Youth Development, I believe it's being called. She looked at me for confirmation. The architectural plans look beautiful. The mock-ups you showed me were incredibly moving. Adjacent properties. An entire block. A center bearing Grandma Patricia's name. The deck had fallen into absolute silence. No one moved. No one spoke. They simply stared at Margaret, at me, at the documents in my hands, trying to reconcile 8 years of assumptions with the reality that had just detonated in their midst. Uncle Gary's face had gone completely white. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Cousin David finally broke it. He stood abruptly from his chair, his face flushed with what looked like anger or embarrassment or some combination of both. Why didn't you tell us? His voice cracked slightly. Why didn't you tell us you ran a foundation? That you were doing all this? I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw genuine confusion in his expression. He actually didn't understand. None of them did. They thought this was about secrecy, about me deliberately hiding information. They couldn't see what had been happening right in front of them for 8 years. I set the envelope with the deed copies on the deck railing beside me, taking a moment to choose my words carefully. When I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, without the anger they probably expected. Because you never cared enough to ask. The words landed softly, but their impact was immediate. Aunt Carol flinched. Cousin Jennifer's hand went to her mouth. Uncle Marcus looked away. You assumed I was a program coordinator or a volunteer at some community center, I continued, my gaze moving across each of their faces. You assumed I was struggling, barely getting by, working a low-level job that didn't matter. And you built your entire understanding of my life around those assumptions. But you never corrected us, Aunt Linda said weakly. You let us think. I let you think what you'd already decided to think, I interrupted gently. Every year at these reunions, you asked me the same questions. Still at the community center. How's work? But you never asked what I actually did there. You never asked about the programs I was building or the communities I was serving. You never asked because you'd already decided it didn't matter. That I didn't matter. Uncle Gary had gone very still, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. The studio apartment you all pitted me for? I said. That was a choice. I graduated with nearly $200,000 in student loans from my master's program in nonprofit management and urban planning. I could have taken a higher-paying job in the private sector, moved into a nice apartment, bought a new car. But I chose to live modestly so I could pay off those loans as quickly as possible and pour every available dollar into building bright futures. I gestured toward Margaret, who stood quietly watching, her expression carefully neutral. My community center work isn't filing papers or answering phones. It's designing and implementing youth development programs that have served over 50,000 children across 14 states. It's building affordable housing initiatives that have helped 3,000 families achieve homeownership. It's creating educational centers that provide free tutoring, mentorship, and college prep to underserved communities. Cousin Jennifer had tears in her eyes now, though whether from shame or shock, I couldn't tell. I work 70-hour weeks, I continued. I've testified before congressional committees. I've negotiated multi-million-dollar partnerships with foundations and federal agencies. I've been featured in national publications and invited to speak at conferences around the country. And every single year, I came to these reunions and watched you discuss your vacation homes and your bonuses and your investment portfolios while you looked at me with pity. Suzanne, Uncle Gary began, but I held up my hand. I'm not finished. My voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. Grandma Patricia knew exactly what I was doing. She visited the Foundation's first office, that tiny space above the hardware store on Maple Street where I worked 16-hour days with 2 volunteers and a donated computer. She saw the programs I was developing, met the families I was helping. She understood what I was building. I picked up the envelope with the deed copies, feeling its weight in my hands. When she transferred the house to me 3 years before she died, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "This house raised you after you lost everything. Now use it to help other children who've lost everything. Build something that matters, Suzanne. Build something that lasts." My voice caught slightly, but I pushed through. So I did. I used that house as collateral for my first real loan. I turned it into our second office location and later into a demonstration project for our youth mentoring program. And when Grandma Patricia died, I didn't cry at the funeral because I was too busy finalizing a grant application that was due the next week, a grant that would fund youth programs in 6 states and serve 12,000 children. The deck was absolutely silent now. Even the breeze seemed to have stilled. The Foundation's budget last year was $47 million, I said, letting the number sink in one more time. This year it will be $52 million. I employ 200 people. I own 3 properties on Maple Street, and I'm building a community center that will bear Grandma Patricia's name and serve this community for decades to come. I looked directly at Uncle Gary. And you stood here today, in front of our entire family, and announced you were going to sell the family asset. You were going to give me a small share as a nest egg to help me get more stable. You made decisions about property you didn't own, spoke with authority you didn't have, and dismissed the one person in this family who's actually built something meaningful. Uncle Gary's face had gone from white to a mottled red. He opened his mouth, closed it, seemed unable to form words. So to answer your question, David, I said, turning back to my cousin, I didn't tell you because you never cared enough to ask. And because nothing I could have said would have changed how you saw me until you were forced to see the truth. Uncle Gary found his voice first, though it came out rough and uncertain, nothing like the confident pronouncements he'd made just an hour earlier. Suzanne, I had no idea if I'd known. Stop. I held up my hand, cutting him off. The word wasn't harsh, but it was final. You didn't need to know my salary or title to treat me with respect. You didn't need to know about my foundation's budget or my speaking engagements or my congressional testimony. I took a step toward him, and to my surprise, he stepped back. The self-appointed patriarch of the Albertson family, retreating from his niece in her thrift store sundress. You just needed to ask about my life instead of assuming you knew it, I continued, my voice steady. You needed to see me as a person worth listening to, worth consulting, worth including in family decisions, especially decisions about a house that was never yours to sell. Uncle Gary's mouth opened, but no words came out. Around the deck, the family stood frozen, watching this reversal of power with expressions ranging from shock to shame to something that might have been dawning understanding. I'm keeping the house, I said, and the simple declaration fell into the silence like a gavel. I'm converting it into the Patricia Albertson Community Center, a free after-school program for children who've lost parents. Tutoring, mentoring, art therapy, grief counseling. Everything Grandma Patricia gave me when I needed it most, now available to any child in this community who's experienced that same loss. I saw Aunt Linda wipe tears from her eyes. Even Cousin Jennifer had set her phone down completely, her face pale and stricken. The house will be fully renovated, I continued. The adjacent properties I purchased will become a learning center and a small playground. We'll serve up to 60 children a day, providing them with safe space, academic support, and adults who see them. Really see them. The way Grandma Patricia saw me. Margaret had remained silent through my entire speech, but now she nodded with obvious approval. The groundbreaking is scheduled for September, she added quietly. The Chen Foundation is honored to be part of the project. I picked up my bag from where I'd set it by the railing and looked at my uncle one last time. The realtor you contacted, Rebecca Morrison, was it? You might want to call her and cancel that listing. Explain that you made a mistake about who owned the property. I'm sure she'll understand. Uncle Gary nodded mutely, all the fight gone out of him. Thank you for hosting, as always, I said, my tone returning to something approaching politeness. Margaret and I have work to finish before Monday's board meeting. I glanced around the deck, meeting the eyes of my cousins, my aunts, and uncles. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I walked toward the stone pathway, Margaret falling into step beside me. Behind us, the deck remained silent. No one called after me. No one tried to stop me. They simply watched as I left, the same way I'd arrived, quietly, without fanfare, still driving my old Honda Civic. But everything had changed. As we reached our cars, Margaret touched my arm gently. That was remarkable, she said softly. Are you okay? I am, I said, and realized I meant it. I really am. I drove away from Uncle Gary's estate with my windows down, the summer air warm against my face. My phone buzzed once, then twice, then a third time, text messages I didn't need to read yet. I knew they'd be some combination of apologies, explanations, and excuses. They could wait. When I reached Maple Street, I parked in front of Grandma Patricia's house and just sat there for a moment, looking at the Victorian facade, the wraparound porch, the oak tree in the front yard where she'd pushed me on a swing when I was 8 years old and still crying every night for my parents. My phone buzzed again. This time I looked. It was Uncle Gary. A long text, not the brief, typo-filled messages he usually sent. I read it slowly. Suzanne, I don't know how to adequately apologize for today. I was wrong not just about the house, but about you, about what you've accomplished, about who you've become. Your grandmother would be so proud of you, and I'm ashamed that I never bothered to see what was right in front of me. You deserved better from this family. You deserved better from me. The work you're doing matters more than anything I've built. I hope someday you can forgive me. Uncle Gary. I read it twice, then set my phone down. The apology was real, I could feel that. And maybe, in time, it would mean something. But right now, standing in front of the house that had saved me, thinking about the center that would save others, I realized I didn't need his validation anymore. I got out of the car and walked up to the porch, running my hand along the weathered railing. In my mind, I could see it all: the renovations, the bright classrooms, the children laughing and learning and healing. The Patricia Albertson Community Center. A legacy that would outlast real estate portfolios and investment returns, and all the shallow markers of success my family had spent decades chasing. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the house, then opened my notes app and typed a single sentence. The greatest legacy isn't what you own. It's what you build for others. I sent it to Margaret, then stood there in the fading afternoon light, feeling Grandma Patricia's presence in every board of the old porch, every leaf of the oak tree, every memory embedded in the walls. "We did it, Grandma," I whispered. "We built something that matters." And for the first time in 8 years, I felt completely whole.